The steak knife scraped against the plate. Once. Twice. Then Raymond set it down with the kind of patience that only belongs to men who've never had to hurry. Keith didn't beg. That was the thing. He just sat there in the zip ties, staring at the floor like he was already somewhere else. I watched from the hallway, mop handle in my hand, heart in my throat. I'd been invisible in that house for 3 years, learned it from my mother, how to move through a room without disturbing the air, how to look without being seen, how to know everything and say nothing. It had kept us safe. It had kept us employed. Earl chambered the round. And I thought about all the times I'd looked away, all the small surrenders my mother had dressed up as wisdom. Don't make yourself a story, Lily. Don't become the reason someone has to make a decision. But Keith had looked at me once, really looked, like I was standing on solid ground and not just floating at the edge of someone else's world. I stepped into the doorway. Raymond's eyes found mine immediately, like he'd known I was there the whole time. That's when I understood. I wasn't saving Keith. I was finding out what I was made of. My mother taught me the rules before I ever set foot inside Raymond Holloway's house. We were sitting in her car, an '09 Civic with a cracked dashboard and an air freshener shaped like a pine tree that hadn't smelled like anything in years, and she was looking straight ahead, not at me, the way she always did when she was saying something she needed me to absorb without argument. "You are background," she said, "like the curtains, like the baseboards. You do your work and you go home, and you do not exist in between." I was 17. I thought she was being dramatic. I stopped thinking that within the first week. It wasn't one moment. It was 100 small ones. The way Mr. Holloway's associates talked in front of Joy, like she was part of the architecture, saying things you wouldn't say in front of a person, because a mop and a person are different categories. The way she'd absorb it, nod, keep moving, come home smelling like their lemon floor polish, and eat dinner in silence, and never once name what had happened to her that day. I used to push, "Tell me, say it out loud, tell me his name." She'd shake her head. "Naming it doesn't change it, Lily. It only makes it heavier to carry." So I learned to do what she did. I learned to make myself small in a room, not cowering, that draws attention, just efficient, eyes on the task, body angled away from conversation, never linger in a doorway, never meet a gaze that hasn't found you first. I got good at it, better than my mother, honestly, because I was younger and quicker, and I'd had her as a blueprint. I knew which floorboards in the east hallway creaked. I knew Raymond's schedule so precisely I could set a clock by his moods. I knew that Earl took his coffee with too much sugar and got mean when it ran out, and that Veronica, Raymond's head of something she never gave a full title for, preferred rooms to go quiet when she entered them. I knew all of it. None of it was mine to use. That was the second rule my mother never said aloud, but lived every day. Knowledge is not power when you have no standing to spend it. The thing is, and this is what took me years to understand, my mother wasn't broken. She was strategic. She had done the math long before I arrived, and the math said that speaking cost more than silence earned. She'd built a life in that equation. A small, careful, real life. She had her own apartment. She had me in school. She had a savings account she added to every month like it was a prayer. She had survived. I used to think survival was enough. Then I turned 20, and something started shifting in me, something my mother must have felt once too, before she learned to quiet it. this low, persistent hum, like a question that won't stop asking itself in the dark. What are you if no one's ever seen you? I didn't have an answer, not until the night I was restocking the supply closet near the east corridor 3 nights ago, and I reached for a roll of paper towels on the top shelf and went completely still, because Brad Kensworth was standing in the kitchen doorway below me, phone pressed to his ear. And he was saying Keith's name, and he was lying. I know what lying sounds like in that house. I've had 3 years to study it. It doesn't sound like nervousness. The nervous ones, the associates who come in over-prepared, the contractors who've padded their invoices, they talk too fast and touch their faces and use words like frankly and to be honest, as if the qualifiers make the rest of it true. Raymond sees through them in minutes. I've watched him do it from across rooms, the way a man reads weather. Brad wasn't nervous. That was the first thing that turned my stomach. He was comfortable, leaning in the kitchen doorway with one shoulder against the frame, voice low and even, the way you talk when you're not afraid of being overheard because it's never once occurred to you that the supply closet has a person in it. The transfers are already logged under his credentials, Brad said. Raymond's going to see exactly what we need him to see. A pause. Whoever was on the other end spoke. Veronica handled the access. It's clean. Another pause. Keith made it easy. You know how he gets, sloppy with his passwords, keeps everything on the same server. We didn't have to manufacture much, just redirect. I didn't breathe. I wasn't making a choice not to breathe. My body simply forgot how. I stood there on the second shelf of that closet, with one hand on a roll of paper towels and every muscle locked, and I listened to Brad Kenworth spend 4 minutes building a coffin for a man who had no idea anyone was swinging a hammer. Then Veronica walked in. She never knocked. She moved through rooms like she owned the deed. I heard the click of her heels on the kitchen tile, and then her voice, quieter than Brad's, but sharper, the way a smaller blade is still a blade. Did you move the drive? Done. Location. Bottom drawer of Keith's desk, behind the hanging files. A pause. He won't find it. He never goes in there. Raymond will. That's the point, Veronica. She was quiet for a moment. I heard the refrigerator open, close, the sound of a glass being set on the counter. Then, make sure your timeline holds. If Raymond asks you when you first noticed the discrepancy, 6 weeks ago, I documented it. And why you waited? Because I wanted to be certain before I brought something like this to him, out of respect. He said the last 2 words with a flatness that made them obscene. Good. Her heels clicked again toward the door, then stopped. Brad. Yeah. He's going to ask her, too. Joy. A beat of silence. Joy doesn't know anything, Brad said. She knows Keith. Raymond will ask anyway. Another pause. Just make sure there's nothing in that kitchen she could have seen. And then they were gone. I stood in that closet for a long time afterward, long enough for my legs to start shaking, long enough for the fluorescent light above me to flicker twice and then hold. My mother's name in Brad Kenworth's mouth, said like a loose end, said like a variable to be managed. I thought about her rule. You are background. You are the curtains. You do not exist. And for the first time in my life, I understood that the rule had never been about protecting us. It had been protecting them. I should tell you that Keith Dawson is not a good man. I want to be clear about that before I tell you why I walked into that dining room for him. He's loud in ways that fill a room uninvited. He laughs at his own jokes before the punchline lands. He has, on at least 2 occasions that I witnessed, spoken to Raymond's household staff the way you'd speak to a vending machine, transactional, impatient, eyes already somewhere else. I've watched him cut off Teresita mid-sentence 3 times in a single meeting because the thought in his own head was more interesting to him than the one coming out of her mouth. He is not a villain, but he's not someone you'd write home about either. Except for once. My mother got sick in February. Not seriously, just the kind of sick that sits in your chest for 2 weeks and makes everything feel like moving through wet sand. She'd called in, and Raymond's office acknowledged it with the specific blankness of people who don't track which hands wash their floors. She'd lose 2 days of pay. It wasn't catastrophic. It was just another small arithmetic of being us. I came in her place. Didn't ask, just showed up with her cart and her schedule and her same silence, wearing her work shoes because mine had a hole in the toe. Nobody noticed the switch. Furniture doesn't have a face. I was mopping the east hallway when Keith came around the corner, moving fast, jacket half on, phone wedged between his ear and shoulder, clearly running late for something that mattered only to him. Standard Keith. I pressed myself toward the wall the way you do, the way you learn to do, to make the hallway feel wider. He walked past me. Then he stopped. I kept my eyes on the floor. People in that house didn't stop. Hey. His voice was different when he wasn't performing for the room, quieter. You're Joy's daughter, right? I looked up. I don't know why. Reflex, maybe, or the plain shock of being addressed like I had a context. Lily, I said. It came out steadier than I felt. He looked at me, not through me, not past me, just directly at me, with the plain attention of someone who has actually registered another human being standing in front of them. It lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then he reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his money clip, and held out a folded bill. Tell your mom to feel better, he said, and then he was gone. Phone back to his ear, voice already climbing back into its performing register. The moment closed behind him like a door. I stood there holding a $20 bill. It wasn't charity that got me. I've been on the receiving end of charity, and it has a particular texture. The slight lean back, the smile that's really a mirror, the way the giver watches you receive it to see their own reflection. Keith hadn't waited to see anything. He'd already rounded the corner before I'd even looked at the bill. He'd just done it. Because my mother was sick. Because he apparently knew my mother had a daughter. Because some part of him, beneath all the noise and the self-satisfaction, had been paying enough attention to know we existed. That $20 sat in my coat pocket for 6 days before I spent it. I still don't know what to do with that. I still don't know what it means that it's the reason I'm about to change both our lives.
Let me tell you about Raymond Holloway's table. It seats 14, solid walnut, no leaf extensions, no folding chairs pulled in for overflow. If you weren't important enough to have a permanent seat, you stood at the wall or you weren't in the room. The chairs are high-backed and upholstered in something dark that my mother treats with a specific conditioner she orders herself because the house account buyer once substituted a cheaper brand and the finish went dull and Raymond noticed within 48 hours. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at the chair for a moment longer than necessary, and by the end of the day, my mother had a new supply line and the buyer had a new employer. That's Raymond. He doesn't punish loudly. He corrects the architecture of a situation and lets the silence explain itself. I've been studying him for 3 years from the edges of rooms, and what I can tell you is this. Raymond Holloway is not cruel. Cruelty requires a kind of passion he doesn't seem to have. He's something more efficient than cruel. He's certain about what things are worth, certain about what behavior costs, certain above all about what his word means, because his word is the load-bearing wall of every relationship in that building, and he knows it, and everyone around him knows it, and that shared knowledge is what holds the whole structure up. Earl understands this. Earl is Raymond's longest-tenured man. I've heard 15 years, maybe more, and he has the stillness of someone who has made a permanent peace with the things he does. He's not large in the way that intimidates by accident. He's large in the way that suggests deliberateness, every movement considered. He stands at Raymond's left shoulder during meetings, and I have never once seen him initiate a word. He waits. That's his entire job description, as far as I can tell. He waits, and then he acts, and then it's done, and he goes back to waiting. William is younger. William still has the slight electric quality of someone who hasn't fully metabolized what he's signed on for. He moves too quickly. He refills glasses before they're empty. He laughs a half-second after everyone else, calibrating. He'll either settle into this life, or it will settle into him in a way that can't be undone. I don't know which I'm watching happen. And Teresita. Teresita has worked in that house longer than my mother. She manages the interior, the schedules, the vendors, the quiet logistics of maintaining a space where powerful men feel comfortable doing uncomfortable things. She is somewhere in her 50s, precise in a way that looks like calm but isn't, and she keeps her eyes at an angle that takes everything in while appearing to look at nothing. She taught my mother that angle. My mother taught it to me. The three of us, Joy, Teresita, me, we have never once spoken about what we know. There is an understanding between women in houses like this that is older than any NDA. You do not name the thing. You carry it, and you work, and you go home. I used to think Teresita was the bravest person in that building for how much she held without breaking. Now I think maybe I had it backwards. Maybe the brave thing, the terrifying, irreversible, you can't unknow it thing, is to put it down.
Suzanne Pratt found me in the hallway outside the dining room 17 minutes before Earl chambered that round. I don't know what I looked like standing there, frozen probably, mop in my hands like I'd forgotten it was attached to me, staring at the strip of light coming from under the closed door. I could hear the low register of Raymond's voice inside, not words, just the cadence of a man conducting something final. Suzanne came from the east corridor without sound. She has that quality. She moves with the efficiency of someone who has learned that arrival is more useful than announcement. She's Raymond's personal assistant in the same way a spine is a personal assistant to a body. She schedules, she filters, she translates his silences into directives that his people can actually follow. She has worked for him for 11 years, and she has the eyes of someone who has seen the full inventory of what that means. She stopped beside me, didn't touch me, just stood there for a moment, looking at the same door I was looking at. Then, quietly, "Go home, Lily." My shift isn't "go home." Not sharp, just flat, the way a road sign is flat. Information, not negotiation. I looked at her. She was still watching the door. "Whatever you think you saw, you didn't. Suzanne, you didn't." She turned then and looked at me directly, and I understood that this was not a threat. Threats come from people who want to protect themselves. What was on Suzanne Pratt's face was not self-protection. It was older than that, more tired than that. It was the face of a woman delivering a verdict she'd already served the sentence for. You have a mother in this house. You have a life outside it. You are 20 years old, and you have not yet made the mistake of believing that doing the right thing and surviving the right thing are the same event. She paused. "I'm asking you to go home." The strip of light under the door, the low voice, the silence where Keith's voice should have been arguing back. "Did you ever—" I started. "Yes," she said, before I'd finished the question, like she'd answered it before, privately, 10,000 times. Life goes on, and I went home, and the man is dead, and I am here, and I have thought about it every day for 9 years, and I am still telling you to go home, because at least you'd be alive to think about it. She held my gaze for one more second. Then she straightened, the micro-adjustment of a woman reassembling her professional exterior over something that will never fully heal, and walked back the way she'd come. I watched her go. 9 years. She'd been carrying it for 9 years, and she still got up every morning and came back into this building and managed Raymond's calls and managed his calendar and moved through these rooms with that precise, practiced composure. I thought about what my mother had said. Naming it only makes it heavier to carry. But Suzanne hadn't named it either. She'd buried it, and it had grown heavier anyway. The mop handle was slick in my hands. My pulse was in my ears. From inside the dining room came the specific sound of a chair scraping back from the table, deliberate, unhurried, and then Raymond's voice finally in words, "Earl, we're done waiting." I stopped thinking. I moved. Suzanne went home. She's been carrying it for 9 years. Lily is standing in the hallway right now, mop in her hands, 30 seconds from the same choice. If you want to know which way she goes and what it costs her, stay with this story.
The bucket wheel caught the door frame, and the sound it made was small and stupid and irreversible. Everything stopped. Earl stopped. His hand was already moving, and then it wasn't. Raymond was standing at the head of the table with the particular stillness of a man who has just had his environment introduce a variable he didn't authorize. Keith was looking at me from the chair, zip ties at his wrists, lips split open and dried to rust, and his expression did something I didn't have a word for. Not hope, too fragile for hope, something beneath hope. The thing that flickers before a person lets themselves consider hope is possible. I stood in the doorway, and I did not run. I want to be honest about what was happening in my body. My legs were conducting a separate argument from my brain. Every inherited instinct my mother had ever installed in me was screaming the same word in the same register, leave, and something newer and raw and apparently more stubborn was refusing. My hands were at my sides. I'd let go of the mop. I don't remember doing that. Raymond looked at me. This is the part that's hard to explain to someone who hasn't been in a room with him. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply redirected his attention from whatever was about to happen onto me, with the full and unhurried weight of a man who has never once in his adult life been interrupted without consequence. His face gave nothing, not anger. Anger would have been easier, not confusion, just that clean, total assessment, the look of a man taking inventory. He was deciding what I was. I held his gaze. I have never in 3 years of that house held Raymond Holloway's gaze. Nobody did. You looked near him, at his collar, at a point past his shoulder, close enough to seem attentive, far enough to communicate the appropriate architecture of deference. Teresita had taught my mother had taught me. It was the first rule under all the other rules. I held it anyway. Something shifted in his face. Not much, a fraction of a degree, the way a compass needle moves toward something it's found without announcement. His head tilted slightly, a question he hadn't decided to ask aloud yet. Earl was watching Raymond. Raymond was watching me. Keith had stopped breathing. I could see it, the held stillness of a man who understands that other people are deciding something and that any movement from him might tip it wrong. The room smelled like dinner and electricity. Raymond said nothing.
He simply waited, and the waiting itself was the most frightening thing I had ever experienced in my life, because Raymond's silences were not empty. They were full of calculation and patience and the kind of confidence that never needs to raise its voice because it has never once doubted the outcome. He was waiting to see if I would break. I felt the tremor move through my hands. I let it. I didn't hide it. Something told me, some instinct I didn't know I had, that pretending to be unafraid would cost me everything in this room, and that the only currency I actually had was the plain fact that I was terrified and standing here anyway. His eyes dropped, once, to my hands. He saw the shaking. He looked back up, and for just a fraction of a second, so brief I almost missed it, something moved behind Raymond Holloway's eyes that I had never seen there before. He was listening. I told it the way my mother taught me to clean, methodically, without editorializing, starting from the edges and working toward the center. 3 nights ago, supply closet, east corridor, second shelf. Brad in the kitchen doorway, phone to his ear. The exact words, the transfers are already logged under his credentials. Veronica arriving. The drive, Keith's desk, bottom drawer, behind the hanging files. The timeline Brad had prepared, 6 weeks, documented, out of respect. The way Veronica had said my mother's name like she was checking a box. I said all of it without stopping. I didn't look at Brad, who had come in from the side room at some point during my first sentence and was standing very still near the far wall. I didn't look at Earl or William or the door. I looked at Raymond, because Raymond was the only person in that room who mattered, and because if I let my eyes drift, I was going to lose my nerve, and the words were going to stop coming, and then it would be over. Raymond didn't move for the entire duration, didn't write anything down, didn't nod, just watched me with that still, total attention, the same look he'd given the chair with the dull finish, which had seemed frightening then, and now seemed, if not safe, then at least like proof he was still calculating, rather than decided. When I finished, the room was completely silent. Then Brad said, "That's not what happened." His voice was measured, confident, slightly aggrieved in the specific way of a man who has been falsely accused and wants you to see how tedious he finds it. He was good at this. I had expected him to be good at this. Raymond didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on me. Brad continued, "She was nowhere near that kitchen. I don't know what she thinks she heard or why she's—" "The drive," I said. Brad stopped. "You put it in a gray sleeve, the kind that looks like a notebook cover. You slid it behind the hanging files in the back of the bottom left drawer of Keith's desk. You used your left hand because you were holding your phone with your right and you didn't want to set it down." I paused. "I saw you do it. I was in the hallway. The desk is 6 feet from the door, and the door was open." I hadn't planned to tell him the last part. It came out because it was true, and because truth was the only weapon I'd walked in with, and I was not going to conserve it. The silence this time was different. I watched Brad's face do something complicated, the confident aggrievement flickering, the calculation underneath it suddenly visible, like a light source moving behind a paper wall. Raymond turned his head, looked at Brad, said nothing. Brad said, "She could be lying." "I could be. The drawer isn't." Another silence. Raymond held Brad's gaze for a long moment with that still, total attention, the same look he'd given the chair with the dull finish, which had seemed frightening then, and now seemed, if not safe, then at least like proof he was still calculating, rather than decided. Raymond shifted his attention to William, standing near the door, and gave him a look that was not quite a nod. William left the room. We waited. Keith hadn't spoken since I'd walked in. I could hear him breathing from across the table, uneven, effortful, the breathing of someone managing pain they're not willing to show. Brad was watching the door. Raymond was watching Brad. And then William came back. He set the gray sleeve on the table without a word. Raymond looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Brad. And Brad Kenworth, composed, confident, the man Raymond had trusted completely, made the last mistake available to him. He ran.
They didn't let me leave right away. That surprised me. I'd assumed the moment the gray sleeve hit the table, I'd be dismissed back into the architecture, back into the baseboards, back into the version of myself that didn't exist in rooms like this. But Raymond had said, quietly, to no one in particular, "She stays." And so I stayed. I stood near the wall and watched Earl and William deal with the aftermath of Brad's decision to run, which did not take long and which I will not describe, and I watched Keith be cut loose from the zip ties by a man I didn't recognize, and I watched Raymond move through it all like weather, present everywhere, located nowhere, the organizing force behind every action that no one looked at directly. Veronica hadn't run. I didn't know then whether that was courage or calculation. Probably calculation. It was maybe 40 minutes later, the dining room quieter now, Keith sitting at the table with a glass of water and his wrists red from the ties, when a hand closed gently around my elbow and steered me into the hallway. Kenyatta. I knew him by sight, Raymond's quietest lieutenant, not quiet like Earl, who used silence as a tool, but quiet like a man who has opinions he's decided the room isn't owed. He was maybe 40, with the kind of face that had probably looked serious since childhood. He'd never spoken to me before. He'd never spoken to most people in that house before, as far as I could tell. He looked at me for a moment, measuring something. Then he said, "What Brad told Raymond about Keith wasn't true. You know that. You were right to say what you said." I waited. "But Keith has been passing information, not to Brad's people, to someone else, a competitor. Small things for the last 8 months. Enough." He paused. "Brad knew. That's where the frame came from. He used a real thread to weave a false one." The hallway was very quiet. Kenyatta continued, "Keith doesn't know this yet. He will, probably soon." He paused again. "I thought you should know before he does, given what you walked in there to do." I didn't say anything for a long moment. This is what I was thinking. Keith in the zip ties, staring at the floor, not begging. Keith's face when I appeared in the doorway, that thing beneath hope. Keith's hand in his jacket pocket, the $20, tell your mom to feel better, already around the corner before I could respond. A man who had looked at me like a person, a man who had also, apparently, been slowly feeding pieces of Raymond's world to someone who wanted to dismantle it. Both of those things were true, simultaneously, without canceling each other out. "Why are you telling me?" I asked. Kenyatta considered that. "Because you walked in there not for Raymond," he said, "and you didn't walk in there for yourself. I wanted to make sure the thing you did it for was something you could still recognize afterward." He left me with that. I stood in the hallway and I looked at the wall, and I tried to locate the feeling I'd expected to have by now, the clean, solid feeling of having done something right. It wasn't there. In its place was something more complicated, heavier, the feeling of a person who has learned that truth and justice are not synonyms and may never be. When I looked up, Raymond was standing in the dining room doorway. He said nothing. He looked at me with that same quiet inventory, and this time I understood that he wasn't assessing what I was. He was assessing what I now knew, and whether I understood the weight of being someone who knew it.
They called my mother in from wherever she'd been kept during all of it. The kitchen, I think, or the back corridor. somewhere the staff went when the house was conducting business that required the furniture to be elsewhere. She appeared in the doorway of the dining room, and her eyes found me immediately, the way a mother's eyes always do, and what moved across her face in that first unguarded second was something I had never seen there before. Not relief. Relief would come later, privately, in the car, in the dark. This was closer to reckoning. Raymond was seated again, the walnut table between us. He had the gray sleeve in front of him and a glass of water he hadn't touched, and he looked like a man who had made several significant recalculations in the last 2 hours and was not finished making them. He looked at my mother first. "Your daughter can leave tonight, both of you, clean. No conversation about what happened in this house. You have my word on that." He paused. "Or she stays, with different terms than what she came in under." Another pause. "That's the offer. It doesn't improve with discussion." My mother looked at him. She had been looking at powerful men in this house for years with that perfected neutral expression, present, attentive, giving nothing. For the first time, I could see how much work that expression required, the musculature of it, the daily discipline of keeping your face from becoming a record of what you actually think. Raymond looked at me then. "Lily," he said. Just that. My name in his mouth, the first time in 3 years he had produced it, possibly the first time he'd known it. It landed differently than I expected, not like recognition, like the opening of an account, like the beginning of a transaction that would have terms and costs and a ledger he intended to keep. I looked at my mother. She held my gaze for a moment. Her face did not change, and then she gave me the smallest nod, barely a movement at all, just a fractional shift of her chin. But I had been reading her my entire life, and I knew exactly what it cost her and exactly what it meant. "You are not furniture. You never were. I just needed you to be, to keep you safe. Go be something else now." I looked back at Raymond. I thought about Suzanne in the hallway, 9 years of silence wearing her smooth. I thought about Teresita and her downward angle and everything she'd absorbed without naming. I thought about my mother's savings account, added to every month like a prayer, and the pine tree air freshener that had stopped smelling like anything years ago, and the supply closet, and the second shelf, and Brad Kenworth saying she never looked up with the absolute confidence of a man who had never once considered that the ceiling had eyes. I thought about Keith, somewhere in this house, water glass in hand, red marks at his wrists, carrying something real that I now also carried. I thought about what Kenyatta had said. "The thing you did it for, I wanted to make sure you could still recognize it afterward." I could. It was just more complicated than I expected it to be. Most true things are. "I'll need my own door key," I said. Raymond looked at me for a long moment. Nothing moved in his face. Then he reached into his jacket and set a key on the table between us, slid it forward an inch. He had come prepared. I didn't know what to do with that. I picked up the key anyway. It was cold and small and heavier than it should have been, the way all thresholds are once you've crossed them and understood that there is no direction back through. She didn't get a trophy. She didn't get safety. She got a cold key and a room that now knows her name, and a truth she'll never be able to put down. If this story sat with you the way it was meant to, share it with someone who's ever been the person in the hallway, the one who saw everything, the one who said nothing, the one who's still deciding. Because Lily decided, and it didn't make everything right. It just made her real. And sometimes that's the whole fight.